Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss spying in the United States on the protests that are currently taking place. There are now accusations that Democrats have put forth in the U.S. Congress, as well as, of course, privacy watchdogs, that there have been drones as well as military assets being used to spy on protesters taking part in, of course, these anti-racism protests that we know are playing out across the United States and, in fact, globally as well. But there has been spying even using a spy plane called the RC-26, which has infrared cameras as well as electro-optical cameras as well. That plane flew over the protests in D.C. as well as Las Vegas. And then we've also had a drone which flew over certain protests as well, keeping an eye on all of that. Now, of course, there has been a denial on the part of the Pentagon that this has taken place, saying that there is not this sort of spying on domestic protests, especially, of course, considering protests are allowed within the U.S. Constitution, peaceful protests, that is, of course. So what exactly is going on here? Because there are concerns, of course, on the part of Democrats and, as I said, privacy watchdogs as well about what kind of a precedent may be set if this is all true and is proven. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Jim Williams, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. He's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's Washington Bureau Chief for LJC Media and Genesis Communications. Joining us from New York this morning is Nina Burleigh, who has been published, I should say, in Newsweek, NBC, Rolling Stone, Medium.com. She's also a best-selling author, most recently, of her book called Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women. And also joining us from New York is Vincent Vernuccio, who is the president of the American Analysis of News and Media Incorporated. He served as an executive in both Democrat and Republican administrations. Frank, Nina, and Jim, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. Nina, let me start with you, if I may. How disturbing is this report, if true, that protesters were spied upon?
Well, it's disturbing, but it's also part of a long kind of history of surveillance in the United States that goes back even further than the September 11th attacks, although after the September 11th attacks, you get the Patriot Act and the prison surveillance program. Look, we have the technology to do this, and it was only a matter of time before they would use it, I think, in situations like this. So, yes, it's disturbing, but it's also not terribly surprising.
Not surprising, Jim, but then certainly it sets a precedent, right, where even peaceful protesters, those who are just, of course, exercising their rights as given to them within the U.S. Constitution, are still being spied upon. Why are they being seen as a threat to begin with?
Well, I think in large part that the administration, the President administration, the Trump administration, it has this obsession, for lack of a better term, with conspiracy. The way they've explained why they've done what they've done is they think that Antifa and other leftist organizations are involved in the protest and specifically involved in violence. Well, both the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, who've done extensive research on this, says that Antifa in the United States is responsible for less than 3% of any of the violent actions that are taken in protests. And as a matter of fact, over 75% of those who take place in the violence in the United States having to do with protests are white supremacist groups. So President Trump needs a bad guy, right? He refuses to acknowledge the racism aspect of it. He wants to be the law and order president, so he needs to find the bad guys in Antifa or whatever other leftist organization he can blame it on. Then that's what he uses to justify the spying on the country. Just like Nina said earlier, it's not new. It's just ramped up and far more sophisticated. And then if you throw in that last and very important area of where they came so very close to utilizing troops on the peaceful people who were at Lafayette Park, which is in the protesting park for the country for years, that was kind of the tipping point for Congress and in many ways, as you see, for the generals themselves who have spoken out against the president.
Frank, what are your thoughts on this? Because there are also murmurs about foreign interference, right? A foreign encouragement of these protests. And I'm specifically talking about the Russians, where there has been talk that, the Russians may very well be encouraging these protests and encouraging, or sowing discord within the U.S. And then that's why possibly the Pentagon and others may want to have been spying on Americans protesting at this time. What are your thoughts on that?
Have heard nothing about Russian interference in any of these events. However, there is significant speculation that China has been attempting to take attention away from what it is doing in Hong Kong, and therefore has been trying to funnel money into some of these demonstrations. The points that were made about Antifa being peaceful are frankly nonsense. Antifa has been quite violent. They have, and perhaps I'm more sensitive to this because some of my fellow journalists have been beaten simply because they have tried to cover Antifa events in Portland and in other places around the United States. In terms of surveillance, when I was in law school many decades ago, I was taught that the Fourth Amendment right to privacy is not going to really apply if you are in a public demonstration or if you're in public at all. If you're at a beach, you're on a sidewalk, walking down the street, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. If spy planes or military assets were being used to spy on cell phones, or on private conversations, things of that sort, certainly the Fourth Amendment would apply whether you're in public or not. But simply walking down the street or participating in a wide open public demonstration, certainly there's not a reasonable expectation of privacy.
That's an interesting point, Nina, where you are out in public, certainly, when you're protesting. So should you have that level of privacy that possibly we're talking about at this time?
Well, first of all, I think the allegation is that they were spying on the cell phones, the text messages. With a Stingray, it's like a telephone, it's like a cell tower, and they were able to pick up with it. They're able to pick up private messages from those phones. So I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know that is. Something that we've all agreed to in this country, that just walking down the street, the government can suck up your data while you're walking around. I know that it's possible, but I don't know that is not a Fourth Amendment problem. But one of the interesting things that I've discovered about this is that the Border Patrol, which was behind a lot of this, the Border Patrol actually has a 100-mile zone from the border inward in which the Fourth Amendment does not apply in our country. So that includes a lot of cities like Washington, D.C. I think New York is probably in it. And, who knew? He had the CBP director, conservative guy, tweeting that they were going to come in to Washington and, stop these violent protests. And the CBP is not the military. The CBP, like the Border Patrol agents and the Bureau of Prisons agents that they had on the streets there, that's a much different thing than the military. They're not trained the way the military is trained. So that too is problematic. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about their surveillance. But the CBP has the tools to surveil, people coming across the border. And, who knew that we do not have Fourth Amendment rights for a 100-mile zone around the edges of our nation?
Jim, I'd like you to, of course, respond to that earlier point that Frank had brought about Antifa. But secondly, I also wanted to bring this up on the point of surveillance, right? This comes down to an issue of trust, right? Where it's, I imagine for a lot of Americans, this breaks a lot of trust that they have in their government to know that they're being spied on. And then on the other side, of course, the argument always is, if you have nothing to hide, then why be worried? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, let me clarify something. If for some reason I made it sound like Antifa wasn't violent, and to Frank's point, they are. That was not my point. My point was there was no evidence by the FBI or any of the law enforcement agencies that Antifa was involved in any way in these protests over the past couple of weeks, okay, specifically the George Floyd protest. So that was the point I was making in that regard. So the other thing, the cell phone tracing and the ability to get involved in that sort of thing, I do think it's a bridge too far. It's a very big brother, and while indeed it may very well be within the parameters of the law, it's something that I think scares most people. And it's like, if you're spying on me to this extent, why? What kind of data are you getting out of this, and how are you making me safer by doing this? And I don't think and that's the theory of the case, I don't think they can make.
What are your thoughts on that issue of trust, right? Because there are reasons why privacy laws are in place, right? There are reasons why people, treasure their privacy so much in a place like the United States or in other countries around the world. Why do you think at this time it would be relevant or even needed for the government to be breaking that and to be reading, for example, text messages or otherwise of simple protesters, asking for systemic racism, for example, to end?
Well, I would certainly agree that reading text messages would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment legally and I think constitutionally as well. But again, there's no evidence at this point that that actually was done. In an era when we've just gone through a national crisis of almost 2.5 to 3 years, where a totally false allegation of Russian collusion has just been disproven, we have to be careful not to give credence to unsupported allegations at this point. That's very important to begin with. So we also have to look at, in terms of just visual surveillance, when we are seeing violence occur, and I have seen this firsthand, I have covered it firsthand, I have seen it firsthand, it would probably be irresponsible for any level of government not to engage in some level of surveillance, as long as it does not violate the Fourth Amendment, to ensure that these events do not get totally out of hand. In fact, as they have gotten dramatically out of hand in places like New York City.
Nina, I'll give you the final word then. You are in New York as well. So what are your thoughts on the violence? Because certainly any government would have to deal with that sort of thing, right? Rioting/looting would be unacceptable. And of course, the vast majority of protesters we know have been peaceful. But nevertheless, how does the one deal with that? Does that then allow space for spying?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, Frank makes a good point that, the violence, the destruction in cities is not a good thing, even for those people who are disadvantaged and are looking for change. So, you do want your government and security forces to be able to control that. But I'm not sure that we want to go to the degree of, using all this technology that we have on our own people. That said, as I said in the beginning, I think that since we have the technology, it was always going to be just a matter of time before they started to use it here.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final point, but of course we appreciate all three of our guests. Jim speaking to us there from Washington, D.C., and Nina and Frank were both speaking to us from New York, respectively. We appreciate, of course, the context that brought to the discussion. Spying, of course, is always a touchy issue, isn't it? Because there's always that balance between how much do you really trust your government versus how much do you need to give leeway to be able to remain safe. Now, if there is foreign involvement, as there has been alleged by some people in the U.S., i.e. that the Russians, for example, are encouraging these protests or seeking to sow discord within the country, does that then give enough leeway to the government to be spying on their own people, even on their text messages when they are taking part in protests and or at home preparing for those protests, for example, using spy planes, using drones, etc., over American cities, drones that are usually flying over other cities outside, of course, the country, in places like the Middle East, for example, and are bombing people over there. Is this a good use of those military assets? Is this relevant? Is this even justified at this time? Of course, a lot to dissect there, and we'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a ruling that the European Court of Human Rights has passed on Thursday, ordering French authorities to pay Palestinian activists around 7,380 euros in damages. Now, all of this stems from a case that was brought against these activists for encouraging people to boycott Israeli products in supermarkets. At the time, originally, they had not been charged, and then an appeals court did charge them, saying that they were inciting discrimination against Israeli products, for example. Now, the European Court of Human Rights says that this goes against, of course, their rights, and secondly, it pointed out that it's not like they were actually incriminated or charged with encouraging violence or discrimination of any sort against any group of people. This was simply about the issue of boycotting Israeli products, which, even though the court says is a highly sensitive political issue, is very much still allowed. Let's discuss this a bit further with our panelists who are joining us now. Joining us from London is Huda Ammori, who is a graduate of the University of Manchester, where she founded and chaired the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Society. She's coordinated the national BDS campaign. Joining us from Manchester is Adie Mormech, who is a grassroots campaigner for Palestine nationally, including BDS. He's previously reported from Gaza and has been coordinator of the International Solidarity Movement. Adie and Huda, thank you both for your time today. Adie, let me start with you. How important a ruling is this? Because again, it clearly says that you are allowed to campaign, of course, peacefully in a supermarket as well, somewhere in France, against products which are, Israeli made or produced within the occupied territories, I should say, but are not yet clearly marked in that sense. Again, bringing awareness for people about the entire issue of BDS.
It is an important ruling, there's no question. It has been a sign, actually, of Israel's weakness internationally, in that the people around the world have grown the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, more awareness, more action taken about what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians for the last 70 years. And it's an action that they have done to commit lawfare against those that are supporting Palestine internationally. They have tried to outlaw boycott, divestment and sanctions. That has been a major approach, and it's had some success, for example, in Germany and France. So this decision by the European Court of Human Rights is a powerful blow to a lot of Israel's main strategy that they have had to really take, because they have lost the streets. They have lost the street battle with their propaganda to try and manipulate people into believing that Israel is in a war, an asymmetrical war, and it's difficult, and that we should be supporting Israel against terrorism. All of that propaganda that is a cover for Israel's continuous ethnic cleansing of Palestine and apartheid policies against the Palestinians is now blown out of the water, because in truth, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement has been causing, has had major furrows into Israel's previous immunity that it has faced. And it starts with the grassroots movement. Of course, it's a civic right. And this it's a shame that we've had to go through the courts to get this ruling, because obviously civil society has a right to boycott a country that they do not agree the practices of. That is a right with the South African apartheid. It worked to support Mandela for the freedom of the blacks in South Africa. And it will work eventually here, when governments will have no choice but to listen to those in the grassroots who are saying, isolate Israel until Palestinians get the same rights as anybody else.
Huda, one of the things that's from me, and you know this very well, that for the BDS, it's been labeled now, of course, an anti-Semitic campaign, right, by many of its opponents. But nevertheless, the ECHR in its ruling said, and I'm quoting it specifically now, the applicants had not been convicted of making racist or anti-Semitic remarks or of inciting hatred or violence, end quote. How important, then, is that distinction to be made publicly, and this openly, by the European Court of Human Rights, where it's clearly saying that BDS does not automatically mean anti-Semitic?
It's an incredible, as Adie has said before, it's an incredible blow to Israel's apartheid regime and their attempts to suppress the BDS activist movement across the world, which is growing day by day. But I have to say as well that BDS is rooted in anti-racism. We're fighting against Israel's discrimination and racism against the Palestinian people. We've seen Israel continue their system of ethnic cleansing, driving Palestinians from their homes, imprisoning Palestinians in Gaza, in the world's largest open-air prison, and continuing to carry out these apartheid policies. And although this is a great, massive victory, and it's so important that these distinctions are made and that the movement is not allowed to, that Israel's attempts to suppress BDS is not working. However, we also know that countries, not just in Europe, but across the world, are deeply complicit with Israel's apartheid regime. And from a UK context, this means over £3 billion from councils going into companies which are arming Israel. We've got 450 million being invested by UK universities into companies which facilitate Israel's apartheid regime and illegal settlements economy as well. And we've got Elbit Systems, Israeli arms companies across the UK, which have weapons which are battle tested on Palestinian civilians being produced in Europe, in the UK. And it's no longer good enough to just say that we are allowed our basic rights to boycott. These are our human rights and our freedom of expression, and we always had these rights to boycott. And it was Israel and others at the top who tried to suppress that. It's now time for these countries and states to sanction Israel and to end their direct complicit links with illegal settlements which they deem as illegal, with war crimes which are war crimes under international law. We've got British students being sent from UK universities to Hebrew University for exchange programs. They stay there for a year in occupied East Jerusalem. We've got British students going and being directly complicit in war crimes, and it's being allowed despite these institutions having policies which state that they will abide by human rights and will seek to do so through their investments and institutional links. Yeah. So I think we're at a point now where we really need to be pushing from the ground up for sanctions, for the boycott, divestment and sanction movement to be implemented.
All right, so Adie, indeed, Adie, the accusations not only of anti-Semitism, but that BDS is rooted in hatred of Israel. I mean, you've heard these phrases and accusations before, I'm sure, many times. But what are your thoughts on that? And secondly, what are your thoughts on what the BDS movement's opinion is of the Trump Middle East peace plan? Because obviously what happens on the ground in the occupied territories, I imagine, does have great influence on the movement as well.
Yeah. Well, firstly, obviously, in terms of the accusations of anti-Semitism, it's purely an attempt to stop people from opposing Israel's continuous crimes against the Palestinians. I mean, boycott, divestment and sanctions was used to great effect by the international solidarity with the blacks in South Africa against the white apartheid regime there. And it was obviously seen historically as a major tool. And these are tools that every activist has at hand. And not just that, but those in the UK, it's actually a moral issue. We've got an Elbit factory just down the road from here in Oldham. This is an Israeli arms factory that tests its weapons on Palestinians, openly selling them and developing them based on bombing Gaza, a population of mostly children, 2 million people. And they are improving their stock the more the bombs fall. Britain is selling hundreds of millions more weapons to hundreds of millions of pounds worth of weapons more since the bombing of Gaza that killed 2,200 people in 2014. The idea that it is in any way they're trying to equate the two is complete nonsense. And actually, it's a moral obligation of mine when there's a factory down the road producing these weapons, making profit from this for an Israeli company. It's a moral issue for me to stop that from happening, no matter who it was being committed against. I have to put myself in between the different companies that are profiting from these crimes. And so if I'm doing that and loads of other people are doing that, and now, thankfully, thanks to a lot of work being done, something that was obviously self-explanatory, that we have a right to boycott, has now been actually endorsed by the European Court of Human Rights, which applies to the UK still, despite Brexit. Then this is a green light for go. It's a green light for everybody to get behind the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. We can see how much Israel is investing so much money into trying to stop the BDS movement as an example as to why it's so effective. And it is time for sanctions. And if we work at the grassroots level and build the BDS movement, it's about Israel's state crimes. It's state crimes. We're talking about a massive opposition to the crimes committed against the Palestinians from a state point of view. And in terms of annexation and the Trump peace plan, well, obviously, the BDS movement is enshrined in human rights, which is the right of return of Palestinian refugees, United Nations Resolution 194. It is ending the illegal military occupation, Article 242 United Nations resolution, and it's for freedom of the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, which is obviously something that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if we're fighting for equal rights, and this is right now even more prescient with the current anti-racism that we are seeing on the streets and the great movements that are growing and the direct action and civil disobedience that is now having an impact, raising awareness. People are opening their eyes about racism and racism against black people. It can happen in the same way for people to finally confront what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And that means taking this kind of action and letting Palestinians have those rights, the same rights that anyone else would expect. So obviously Trump's peace plan doesn't incorporate any of those rights. It doesn't see Palestinians as equal. And now we're saying finally, both for the Palestinians and everybody else, equality or nothing. And that also means justice. So this is what the BDS is enshrined in. That's why this annexation and the Trump peace plan has got nothing to do with liberating Palestinians and giving them their rights. So we're calling on everybody to grow the BDS movement, which will eventually reach government level, and they'll have no choice, just like for South Africa. And eventually Palestinians will get their rights and will get their freedom.
Okay, so Huda, final word, and I'll just play devil's advocate one more time. But when, if the end goal is for Palestinians, obviously, to get their rights, get their equal rights, what does that then mean for Israelis, right? Because that's always been also one of the most contention that the Israelis have with the BDS movement is that, again, within that accusation of anti-Semitism, they say that the BDS wants all Israelis to leave, for example, or all Jews to leave, I should say, in fact. Is that what the end goal is?
No, of course not. You cannot undo a wrong with another wrong or exodus of people. The BDS movement has clear demands which are enshrined under international law and human rights. And as Adie said, that includes ending the occupation and colonization of Palestinian territories. For the Palestinian citizens of Israel to have equal rights as their Jewish counterparts, because right now they have more than 50 laws which discriminate against them just because they are Palestinian. And for the Palestinian refugees which have been expelled from their homes by Israel's system of ethnic cleansing and by brutal force to have their right to return to their homes. And this is a right enshrined under international law. Granting Palestinians their rights under international law and human rights conventions does not take away from any other group's rights. But we cannot have a system to continue to discriminate against a whole population of people based on where they are from. This is apartheid. We are in the 21st century. We are talking about anti-racism everywhere. It was never acceptable. It wasn't acceptable for South African apartheid, and it's not acceptable now today in Palestine. And to grant Palestinians their rights is what has to be done for justice to be achieved. And that also means that we have to, as international activists, ensure that we are challenging our institutions, our companies, our governments, and their complicity with this system of oppression against Palestinians.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that final word, but we appreciate, of course, both Huda and Adie for their time today, both of them respectively speaking to us from UK, Huda speaking to us from London, and Adie speaking to us there from Manchester, giving us, of course, clarification on what BDS exactly stands for, what this ECHR ruling signifies at this point in time, and how BDS movement has strengthened, regardless of the accusations against it of anti-Semitism, as well as of asking for all, for example, Jews to leave. All of those clarifications are very, very important at all times, really, when it comes to this movement, because, again, the accusations against it are very serious, and those things need to be spoken about openly and regularly so that there are no qualms about exactly what all this stands for. This is, as both Adie and Huda said, for Palestinians to gain equal rights, which they do not currently enjoy, and that, I imagine, no party on either side can really argue is not the reality on the ground. That is the reality, whether you see it as Jews-only roads across the occupied territories versus Palestinian roads, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of details, of course, there. Nevertheless, of course, those accusations of anti-Semitism, of hatred, et cetera, continue to grow as well as the movement also grows in strength around the world. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now we're going to discuss Donald Trump and his authorizing of sanctions and additional visa restrictions against ICC personnel. Now, the International Criminal Court has been wanting to look into what are alleged war crimes on the part of the U.S. military, as well as intelligence officials in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. And Fatou Bensouda, the ICC prosecutor, has been trying to have this sort of case started, as well as the probe properly begun on the ground there in the U.S. for a while now. An important detail certainly is that the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC and says it is a kangaroo court, as Mike Pompeo has called it recently. Also, of course, the U.S. is very sensitive about its military and intelligence officials being judged by international courts, such as, of course, the ICC. Nevertheless, for many, this leaves a bad taste in the mouth, right, where you can't then have anybody policing the U.S. and its actions around the world. At least that's the image that many of us outside the U.S. seem to be getting from looking from the outside in. Is the U.S. essentially above international law in some ways, where it gets to say, listen, we police ourselves, we'll judge ourselves, you give us the information, is what I believe Mark Esper said, and we'll be the judge of whether or not our officials, our servicemen, are guilty of any war crimes or not. Is that the way international law should work? Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Thomas Pogge, who is a Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs and founding director of Global Justice Program at Yale. He's joining us now from New Haven, Connecticut. Thomas, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this entire case? Of course, it's important to note that the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC, but nevertheless, this just looks bad, doesn't it?
It certainly does look bad. Yeah, there are three different dimensions to this problem. There's the legal dimension, and there the United States, of course, tries as far as possible to stay away from any kind of legal commitment. Then there is the moral dimension, which you nicely brought out in your introductory commentary already. We are striving for a world in which everybody is subject to certain rules, in which violence cannot just be used at will, but in which it is subject to constraints that are supervised and judged by independent judges. And so the United States should ideally be subject to such a regime. It can, of course, play a role in determining what that regime is, set up in international court. But really, ultimately, it should be subject to it as well. And then the third thing is the explanation. Why is it happening? So international relations is a struggle for power. Different powers are trying to maximize their influence in the world. And power has three main sources. There is military power, there's economic power, and then there is what they call soft power, everything else. The US is traditionally strongest on the military side. And so the US wants the world to be one in which military power matters a lot. And that sort of a world is a world in which military power is not constrained. So it's not just Donald Trump who doesn't want US military power to be unconstrained. This is a long history. Yeah. If you go back to 2002, we had the act that was passed by the US Congress authorizing the president to use military force to free people who might be charged in The Hague in front of the International Criminal Court. So we will not allow our military personnel to be charged in such a court, even if they commit war crimes in a country that is subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC.
But then that opens the Pandora's box, right, Thomas, as I'm sure you appreciate, where for the U.S. adversaries then, and of course for possible crimes that they may commit or not, if those accusations come forth against somebody who is an adversary, I would imagine the U.S. would wholeheartedly want the ICC to be investigating that, to swoop in and to take control of that situation?
Well, in principle, yes. I think they would like the support that they might get from such an investigation if it is an enemy of theirs. But I don't think they would want to pay the price of subjecting themselves to the same sort of mechanism, or even their allies, right? They want to reserve the right to say these people are immune from that kind of investigation.
And so then what kind of ramifications does this have, I think, Thomas, for international law in general, right? Because even at the United Nations, and you know this, of course, I'm sure very well, where there have been, those long-standing concerns about just, for example, how the Security Council is set up, with the veto-wielding powers in the hands of certain countries, where it's just we are, whether we like it or not, living in an unequal world where certain countries have the say over really the rest of us and how the rest of us get to live in peace or not. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's right. In order to get the strong to subject themselves to any kind of rule of law, you have to give them a system of rules that advantages them in some way, right? They don't want to be equals. They say, either I will not play under rules at all, I will just stay outside, or you give me a special deal, for example, a veto power in the Security Council or something like that. And that's been the post-World War II order. And it is subject to these two pressures. On the one hand, there is the pressure from morality that says, why should you get any special privileges, any special rights, just because you have more military power or more economic power? Yeah. And on the other hand, there is also this prudential pressure that we want the world to be orderly. We want it to be predictable. We don't want it all to fall apart, where the strong just say, okay, fine, if you don't like these unequal rules, then we just do no rules at all, and you'll see where that will get you.
All right, then a final comment then, Thomas, I wanted to ask you then, what will be the going forward, do you think? Are we moving in a positive direction when it comes to having a more equal world, a more just world in this sense? Because, the U.S., for example, has its hands in many areas around the world, right, militarily. And, of course, you correctly pointed out that the U.S. is a huge military power. No one denies that. But it has bases in so many parts across the world. It's really quite involved in others' business, if we're completely honest with ourselves. Do you think that will change, that the U.S. may very well self-reflect on what exactly its role is in the world?
It will reflect, but it will not change, no. As I said, right, there are three components of power. The U.S. derives a great deal of its political power from its military might. And the U.S. cannot make up for any loss of military power by substituting economic power or substituting soft power. Economic power, it is losing against India and China. They have higher growth rates, and in the long run, I don't think the U.S. will find it easy to maintain even the 1/4 of the world product that it currently holds. The U.S. really puts its eggs into the military basket, and it is therefore interested in continuing a world in which tensions are high, in which there is a bit of a Cold War atmosphere. You see the recent tensions with China. This is deliberately revved up, create tension with China in order to always keep the world apprised of the fact military power matters. When push comes to shove, it's the military power that matters, and the military power, we have it. We have more than 50% of the world's military power. We could take on the whole rest of the world combined, and that should never be forgotten.
Very well, Thomas. We'll leave that, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out this morning to speak to us and for putting that all into context for us. A wonderful discussion. I believe our viewers must have really benefited from that. The ICC, of course, as we've spoken about, has asked for this probe to begin into U.S. actions, possible war crimes, as are alleged by Fatou Bensouda and others, the prosecutor of the ICC. Nevertheless, the U.S. has always been against the ICC coming in and investigating its military, its intelligence officials, and their, of course, actions in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, or elsewhere in the world where the U.S. is militarily involved or involved in other fashions through intelligence or otherwise. But does this mean that the U.S. is above international law? What is the role of the ICC then in today's world if governments get to pick and choose whether this international criminal court has jurisdiction over them? I mean, does that even really make sense? Can we then really even say we're in a world which is equal and which is just? And of course, we're not in an equal world, as Thomas and I both agreed upon, even at the United Nations Security Council, just with the veto-wielding power of certain countries over all of us. makes quite obvious whether or not we can live in peace and health, even really, if we're completely honest, comes to the fore. So there are a lot of issues, of course, to dismantle when it comes to this entire issue, but nevertheless, the U.S. still sees itself as above the ICC and unbecoming of giving in to such a court at all. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.